any kind of money, whatever gets used as money, the fact that it's used as money will incentivize anybody who can produce it to make more of it. So if there was an easy way to make gold, we'd all be out there looking into gold prospecting, but then, we'd flood the market with gold and then it would stop being gold. And the reason that gold was money is because it was very hard to find in large quantities compared to the existing supply, which I explain in more depth in the Bitcoin Standard.
Saifedean Ammous, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me, Tom. It's a pleasure to be here.
Dude, I am super uneasy to make sure that I help get these huge ideas across. You've written a book called, well, you've written multiple books, but the one we're going to be talking about today is the Fiat Standard. You also wrote the Bitcoin Standard. As I have gotten more into understanding Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies in general, then you begin to encounter the ideas of what money is, what fiat is. I mean, this is something I've been in my entire life, but had no idea what it was. If you can, what I want to do is start with a brief description of what fiat is. Then we're going to tell people what the subtitle of your book is, which I think will set us up nicely. And then I have a really interesting quote from your book that I want to get into. So what is fiat?
So the way that I wrote the Fiat Standard was almost like an imitation of the Bitcoin Standard. It was like a knockoff of the Bitcoin Standard in that with the Bitcoin Standard, I looked at Bitcoin with, everybody's an amateur when it comes to Bitcoin. It's such a new thing. Nobody's an expert in Bitcoin. So I decided to just come at it from first principles, try and figure out how it works, look at it functionally, and then tease out the implications of this thing continuing to work and operate. And that worked out pretty well. The book sold very well. I heard from a lot of people that they enjoyed it and they liked it and it was quite influential. So then I thought for my next trick, I should do the same thing for the fiat monetary system, which is the monetary system that everybody uses. But in a sense, we've never had the luxury of looking at it with fresh eyes because, it's like asking a fish to asking a fish about what the water is like. Well, we've always been in water. It's just what we're used to. So I decided, imagine if you were coming at this civilization that was using this monetary system from scratch, and you were trying to understand how this thing works. So what is it? How does it function? Explaining it as if it's just another digital currency similar to Bitcoin, and trying to draw analogy with Bitcoin. And I found that to be a quite powerful analytical tool in order to understand how fiat works. And it was the perfect setup for writing the sequel to the Bitcoin Standard, since the Bitcoin Standard was all about how, why I think Bitcoin is such a big deal and why I think Bitcoin is going to succeed. The question that the Bitcoin Standard leaves you with is, well, then how is it going to interact with the prevalent monetary system? How will this survive? How is it going to grow? What's going to be the relationship between the fiat monetary system and the Bitcoin monetary system? And in the Fiat Standard, I thought, this is really the perfect way of approaching it. Let's study fiat, and then that'll help us figure out how it would interact with Bitcoin. And I found that to be quite a useful framework. So by drawing analogy to how Bitcoin works, Bitcoin has nodes, Bitcoin has mining, and we have a decentralized network where everybody determines the rules. If you just carry these things into fiat and then try and analyze how fiat works, well, you find in the case of fiat, we don't have a distributed network of nodes. We have, there are nodes, but they're not all equal. It's not peer-to-peer, like in Bitcoin, where every node gets to dictate its own rules, and then the network only works between the nodes that agree on the rules, and so it's entirely voluntary. Well, Bitcoin is different. Fiat is different. Fiat is a network where there's one sovereign node that determines the rules for everybody else, and that's the US Federal Reserve. And then there are all these partial nodes around the world that can sort of determine the rules locally, the local central banks, but then they are kind of subordinate to the master node that runs the global monetary system. And that, I think, is quite important to understanding the political situation in the world, the geopolitics of the world today. Thinking
because it opens up people to manipulate it. Because one thing I've heard you say about if I were going to have a concern about Bitcoin, it would be that at some point something happens where it begins to centralize, that there are fewer nodes, and it becomes more likely that somebody can manipulate it. And so as you start talking about the fiat standard, it's like, hey, the entire problem with the fiat standard is that it can be manipulated. Now, to your earlier point about this is water, right? What's it, Brian Foster Wallace? I'm forgetting his first name, I think. That fish don't even understand that they are in water. Before I started the journey into crypto, I thought of money as a force of nature. It just is a thing, like gravity. It is, and first principles would lead you to the axiomatic understanding that money is, and there's this paper representation of what money is that makes it easy to transfer, but I had no concept of a lot of how it's entirely constructed, wildly manipulated, even if you assume good intent, that it is this thing that is designed to orchestrate society. And so I was like, okay, that was a very eye-opening introduction to things. And then as you begin to peel back the layers and you realize that there's a disturbing setup, right? Breaking away from gold, and we'll get into that. But that there is it's influencing society in ways that you would never have guessed because you're so used to it. And I want to talk about the subtitle of your book. So if fiat money is money by decree, the government says there's nothing backing this other than I say it's valuable, and so as long as everybody agrees we're good, I can print as much as I want. I can just keep making it up because it is literally money by decree. Gold is money by star explosion, right? So it's limited because it is a metal that happens when stars explode that embed themselves into the crust of our Earth, and therefore there's a limited quantity. So you begin to understand, okay, wait, there's different types of money, and then obviously we'll get into Bitcoin and hard money and sound money and all of that. But I want to give people that setup of money is not a property of nature, that it is fiat, is something that is created and by a ridiculously small number of nodes, to use the Bitcoin analogy.
Yeah, that's the, the next question is, all right, so there's nodes, but then what about mining? We know how Bitcoin mining works, and we know how, well, I explained it in the Bitcoin Standard, and we know how gold mining works. Well, how does fiat mining work? So most people have the idea that it's just fiat is paper money and then the government prints it when it's needed in order to keep the economy going. And that's false. The majority of fiat money is digital. Less than 10% of dollars are in paper form. The majority of dollars are digital dollars. They don't exist in physical form. So how do they come into existence? And the answer to that is that fiat money comes into existence when debt is created. When loans are made, new fiat money is generated. And this is really the key starting point of the analysis of the book, because this is a very powerful concept. Once you draw an analogy between lending in the fiat world and mining in Bitcoin and in gold, a lot of the world around us begins to make a lot of sense. So any kind of money, whatever gets used as money, the fact that it's used as money will incentivize anybody who can produce it to make more of it. So if there was an easy way to make gold, we'd all be out there looking into gold prospecting. But then, we'd flood the market with gold and then it would stop being gold. And the reason that gold was money is because it was very hard to find in large quantities compared to the existing supply, which I explain in more depth in the Bitcoin Standard. And in Bitcoin, we have the difficulty adjustment, which continues to make mining Bitcoin difficult for most people and only makes it profitable for the people who do it very efficiently. The most efficient miners, the ones who mine at the lowest electricity cost. Well, in the case of fiat, basically anytime a government-backed entity or a central bank-backed entity is able to issue credit, new money is made. So what does that tell you about?
This is so scandalous. When I came across that in the book, I literally took a note. Wait, that's how loans work? Is this always how loans worked and money gets into the system? Can you give the example that you gave in the book about how you've got a house, you're about to buy a house. The house exists, but the money doesn't. And it is going to come into existence. I was like, what? This is still, I can't believe I'm actually understanding what you're saying correctly. This seems impossible, and I discovered this 48 hours ago when I started reading your book. How's this true?
Yeah, well, I mean, so let's say you were going to sell me your house. Your house is worth $1 million. I agree with you that I want to buy the $1 million house from you. Now, I have two options. I can take $1 million from my money and go and give it to you in cash. And then in that situation, no debt is created, and so no new money is created. The money supply stays constant. All that happens is that I have $1 million less and you have $1 million more. But most people obviously are buying homes by borrowing. So I go to my bank and I tell them, hey, I found this house, I want to buy it, I want to borrow $1 million. Forget about the down payment for simplicity now. So let's say I'm just going to go borrow $1 million from the bank. Well, the bank is not going to take $1 million from other depositors and give them to me. They don't need to do that. That's the whole way in which banking works in the fiat system. They will give me a loan, and because they're backed by the central bank, because they're a regulated financial institution that is backed and regulated by the central bank, they will make those new $1 million. So the money supply will increase by $1 million after that loan is generated. So the bank now owns a $1 million loan. I owe the bank $1 million. You have an extra $1 million in your bank account, which you got from the bank, and I own the house. So, you know, the money supply has increased by $1 million. We've devalued everybody else's money in society in order for me to buy your house. And that's really very powerful when you think about it, because it's like mining. You know, when you mine new gold, you devalue everybody else's gold. When you make new Bitcoin, you're kind of devaluing everybody else's Bitcoin with the new Bitcoin that you're producing. And when you make a loan from a financially from a financial institution that is backed by the central bank, new money is created. Note, it's not the same if I borrowed that money from my mom. My mom takes $1 million from her bank, she gives them to me. That doesn't create any new money. My mom is not backed by the central bank to issue those loans.
Great news. If you're watching this episode, that means you're actually doing the work to research this new world of finance, cryptocurrencies, NFTs, Web3, all of it. Seriously, I commend you. Most people are going to write all of this off without even looking into it. And that means that most people are going to miss out on what could be, in my opinion, one of the greatest wealth transfers in history. Now look, it's incredibly important that you do your own research. I cannot see the future. I just know that something very important is happening right now, and it warrants you taking the time to look at it, to do the research. Now, if you're excited at all about learning about all of the changes, then I invite you to join my special community of like-minded people on our Discord by going to impacttheory.com/Discord. Since you're watching this video and learning about crypto and the future of the blockchain, you should know that this really is the future of impact theory. About 9 months ago, we decided to pivot because I can see that this is where the world is going, and this is truly the moment of disruption that we've been looking for, and Discord really is the best place for you to begin to engage with that side of impact theory. We've launched our first flagship NFT, the Impact Theory Founders Key, and our holiday feature narrative, Merry Mods, which is also an NFT project, and I promise you, you're going to be blown away by what we're doing. We've got a lot more planned for years to come. We have a long-term, very aggressive, very fun roadmap. So if you want to turn this learning into action, I hope you will join us in our Discord community at impacttheory.com/Discord. All right, back to today's episode.
So, all right, hold on. I understand the words you're saying. It seems impossible that this is true. So what are the guardrails on a bank? Because what was it, Charlie Munger, that said, tell me the incentives and I'll tell you the outcome. So as I hear that a bank can now, because they're going to get the fees from servicing that loan, and that means they're incentivized to loan as much as they can, because they literally get to make up the money and then take a pull off that. Who limits that?
Well, what limits that is the central bank. The central bank doesn't just allow them to go out and give loans to everybody, although it might look like it at times.
And the central bank is per country?
Yeah, every country has its own central bank, more or less.
That all use the same idea?
Yep, basically, yeah. This is the 20th century for you. So the central bank puts regulations on who can borrow and how they can borrow and what they're able to borrow. And so, you know, there are criteria. They're not just going to give $1 million to anybody, although, you know, recently it looks like it.
Aren't they?
Yeah, but I mean, generally, you're gonna have to have some income and some kind of way of demonstrating that you are able to make those payments back, and that's kind of the political restraint on fiat mining. That the central bank doesn't just allow anybody to do it, and that if a central bank if a bank issues too many loans, then the central bank will punish it in certain ways. It'll have liquidity problems and it might get liquidated and go out of business. But in reality, the real check on this is the fact that if you just issue too many loans, you have a lot of insolvent borrowers, and then those borrowers don't pay you back, and then that causes that causes the money supply to contract. So the way that we limit the growth of the fiat money is that credit creation is in itself self-correcting. And that's the important insight that we gain from the Austrian School of Economics and the Austrian business cycle of the Austrian theory of the business cycle, which is that banks want to create as much credit as they can, and they do, but then that just means many more people have money and are investing and have resources, and that leads to central banks, that leads to a bubble, and then that leads to a collapse. And then when there's a collapse, I can't pay back my loan to the bank. Well, that reduces the money supply now because the bank has to market.
It's gone now.
Yeah, the money's gone now, and the bank has the house. So I'm homeless. The bank has the house. The bank needs to sell the house. But obviously, now that we've had a credit crash and the bank can't issue as much credit as it used to before, when it tries to sell that house, there won't be as many suckers as like me, willing to buy the house. So they're probably going to get a lower price for it. So the $1 million house is going to sell for something like $500,000 house. And so this kind of process of boom and bust is what's limiting the credit money system from continuing to grow. And that's kind of the equivalent of the difficulty adjustment in Bitcoin, in that it limits the growth of the money supply so that it's not hyperinflationary. And in fact, when we've seen examples of hyperinflation, we have seen hyperinflation under this fiat monetary system. In fact, it's the only monetary system that has seen hyperinflation. But when we do see hyperinflation, it's not through credit creation. It's when the credit creation gets out of hand, and then the government wants to bail out its buddies, and then they crank the actual physical printing presses. So that's the case in Lebanon right now. Like, the actual physical bills have gone up in circulation. The physical bills in supply has gone up by about 7-fold in the first 2 years since the currency began to devalue. So they've gone 7-fold, and so the price of the currency has dropped more than 90%. Yeah. But generally, that's the case in Zimbabwe, and that's the case in Venezuela. Because what happens is that, you keep doing this credit. What governments do is they keep playing this credit creation game like an addict taking another hit of crack all the time. And then, the come down keeps getting worse and worse. And then to ameliorate the come downs, they start printing money. Once you get into the phase of printing money, that's when it goes to the dogs, basically.
All right. There's a few things I want to anchor around for people that are like me, where they have enough information to follow along, but they need some of these breadcrumbs put together. So I had read your whole book, and because I do everything audio, I actually hadn't seen the subheadline. And I thought, after reading this, I need to see like the subhead of this. And so I will read the subheadline, which is "The Debt Slavery Alternative to Human Civilization." Okay, so then it's like, all right, wait a second. Is this a good alternative? Like, what are we talking about here? And I want to read a quote from your book, which you said earlier, but I think this quote really sums it up. Getting others, this is a quote from the book, getting others into debt is the Fiat Standard's version of gold prospecting. So the whole way that the fiat system gets more of this very coveted thing is to get, as you just walked us through, people to take on debt, which creates these debt cycles, which I'd heard about but didn't understand. And so we're in this sort of forever boom and bust, constantly pulling levers, like trying to engineer the system. And I'm curious to hear, what's your sort of final take on the fiat system? Because I don't want to put words in your mouth, but you were basically like, I want to look at fiat because it's done some good things. So where is the sort of good? Where does it start to break down? What's your final edict on the fiat standard? Having read the book, I think I have a pretty good idea. But what is the final take on this? And what do you mean by that debt slavery alternative to civilization?
Yeah, so historically, all through human history, what humans have done is we've always looked around and used things as money. And naturally, whether through our reason or just through evolutionary selection, money ends up being the hardest thing to produce. That's why the whole world was on a gold standard by the end of the 19th century, because the hardest thing to produce will hold on to its value much better than everything else.
Is that why it's called hard money? It's hard to produce?
Exactly. Yeah, that's what it is. It's hard to produce. And easy money is easy to produce. So the harder our money, the more reliably we can provide for our future. You know, you earn money today, and if your experience throughout your life and the experience of your family and friends around you is that you save $100 today, and then next year you expect it to be worth 102, for instance, you're likely to save quite a bit of that money. Much more than you would save if your experience was that if I saved those $100 next year, their value is going to be something like, let's say, $85, right? So by saving, if you lose money from saving, you're less likely to save, you're more likely to spend that money today. If the money is likely to appreciate, you're more likely to save for the future. So historically, we've always moved toward harder money, and that has led us to constantly save more because that allows us to provide for the future. And that is the basic building block of civilization. One of my favorite economists, Hans Hermann Hoppe, says the lowering of time preference is what initiates the process of civilization. And lowering time preferences refers to the idea that your time preference is the degree to which you prefer the present to the future. And everybody prefers the present to the future because the present is certain, the future is uncertain. So if I gave you a choice between having a house today and having that house 10 years from now, you obviously would prefer to take it today. You wouldn't want to wait the 10 years. So if I gave you the same choice between the same amount of money, the same purchasing power today or in a year, you prefer to take it today. But there's the higher your time preference, the more you prefer today and the more you discount tomorrow. So the less you care about tomorrow. So as we develop the ability to have a stronger, harder money, we're able to provide for our future more. We start discounting the future less. We start caring about the future more. We start providing for the future more. And that makes us more, more future-oriented. And so we become more moral. We become better humans. We become more civilized. We accumulate more capital. And we save more and we invest more. And then, the more we save, the more capital we have available for investment, the more we invest, the more the productivity goes up, the more our standard of living increases. That's really the process of civilization. That's really, I like my best metaphor for it is to think about the fisherman who goes from trying to catch fish with his hands to building a fishing rod. That's capital. You have to sacrifice time fishing with your hands in order to spend that time building a fishing rod. But then the result of that is that you can now have a much higher productivity after you've made that initial sacrifice. And then you build a small boat, and then you build a fishing net, and then you build a bigger boat, and then you build... Currently, our civilization has advanced to the point where we have giant trawlers that last 100 years and continue to fish for 100 years. People 100 years ago were giving up consumption to build those gigantic boats that are still in use until today. So that's the process of civilization, and it's a process that's spurred by the hardness of money. The harder the money, the more we are able to provide for our future, the more we invest in the future, the more capital we accumulate. And that was basically the process of humanity up until the turn of the 20th century. And then fiat really came along and provided us with an alternative to this, where now, gold's supply increased at around 1.5% to 2% per year. And now fiat's supply increases at around something like 14% per year on average. Some currencies increase a lot more, some currencies increase a lot less. For the best currencies, the US dollar and the euro and the yen and the Swiss franc, these currencies increase every year at around 7, 8, 9, 10% or so. Some currencies increase at 100 or 200% or so, like the Lebanese and Venezuelan currencies. But if you counted an average market weight, it's around 14% or so. So we go from 1.5% per year increase in the money supply to 14% per year increase in the money supply. So that is happening because of the massive incentive for mining fiat through issuing debt. And that's really the subtitle of the book. We move from a process of human civilization where everybody is saving and accumulating wealth in hard money in order to have a better existence in the future, to a process of debt slavery where everybody's getting into debt because debt is mining money. Debt is creation of money. So you have a huge incentive to go and borrow for buying your house, to go back to the original example, because when you buy it with your own money, you're not creating any new money. But when you buy it with the central bank, with the bank's money, new money is created. So you and the bank come out ahead in that game because you're essentially devaluing the money of everybody else in society. So that means everyone is in debt. Individuals are in debt, corporations are in debt, governments are in debt, everybody's borrowing, everybody's indebted to their future, everybody's a slave essentially, and that doesn't change. It's not like, if you get richer, then you snap out of this game and you're secure. On the contrary, the richest people are the ones who borrow the most. And so everybody is in debt, and everybody has that insecurity of debt. Everybody has payments to make at the end of the month, and if they don't make them, they lose their business, they lose their home, they lose all kinds of different things. So we move to the system of universal debt slavery, basically. And that's really what I try and explain in terms of what fiat does. And I mean, this is obviously a very high price, but I do try and think about, what the benefits of it are. And to be entirely fair, there are benefits to the fiat monetary system over the previous thing that it replaced, which is that gold is very expensive to move around. And that's why fiat was able to replace it. It wouldn't have replaced it in a free market because the cost of moving gold is still much cheaper than this enormous cost of, destroying human civilization and turning everyone into debt slaves. But the fact that moving gold around was so expensive meant that governments could get away with banning you from using gold. Ultimately, you had to, in order to use gold as a trade, as a medium of exchange, as money for trade, as the world became more globalized by the end of the 19th century, all of people's money was centralized in banks, and then all of the banks were centralized in a central bank. That was just an inevitable outcome of the fact that moving gold around is expensive. And so you need to have all of that gold centralized in central banks. And therefore, in the early 20th century, when governments got into wars in World War I, they all went off the gold standard. They all confiscated their citizens' gold, and they all issued more paper than they had gold in reserve. And since then, they've gone off the gold standard, and it's now been an entire century of this insanity. And I think it has been enormously, enormously catastrophic for humanity. I think we take it for granted. We think that this is just human nature, but I think there's a reason that a lot of very bad things that happened in the 20th century aren't such a prevalent part of human nature before. I think this
I want to get into what that is, but first I want to ask a hard question, which is, if hard money is so good, how did it get replaced by fiat? And is it really just because it's hard to move from place to place? Or is it the combination which you were stating just now, which is the government comes in and squashes it, basically, because you said it's not a free market, so they're manipulating it somehow, breaking down that free market, and leveraging that it's hard to move from place to place? I'm asking the same question in a different direction. Has Bitcoin solved the only real issue, well, I guess two issues, that made the previous take on hard money, gold, vulnerable, which is that it's easy to move across time and space, and it's hard, meaning that there will be 21 million units, and that is it, period, full stop.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's kind of, thanks for ruining the book, I guess. But
trust me, when people get into it and they see you detail, explaining the fact that you have a whole section talking about how fiat destroyed food, there is much more in the book for people to discover. I mean, it's literally crazy. I could have, unless we read it in real time, we would not be able to destroy the number of ways that you break down the, hey, this is water thing, this thing that you don't think is a problem or that you don't even notice. Let's start looking at it. It's terrifying, and we're going to go through some of it. But I want to answer that question to see if I'm really understanding the fundamental issue here.
I think that's really what it is. So the Bitcoin Standard, my first book, focuses on Bitcoin's salability across time, Bitcoin's ability to hold value across time, and that's what made gold. That's what made gold money, which is the fact that it is the hardest money. Its supply increases at only around 1.5% per year, and so therefore gold is excellent at holding on to its value. And that's why the Bitcoin Standard has many examples about how harder money eventually drives out easier money all throughout human history. The Fiat Standard focuses on salability across space, on money's ability to hold on to its value across space as you move money around. And that was gold's Achilles heel, because in the Fiat Standard, I look at this, I look at how expensive it was to move gold around. And I look at the example of World War I, when gold was demonetized effectively, when those countries moved off the gold standard. We see that the cost of moving gold around across the Atlantic, for instance, was around 0.5%, somewhere between 0.1 to 1% of the value of the gold that you move around. So that means that a bar of gold costs a bar of gold to move across the Atlantic 100 times, roughly. 100 to 200 times you move it across the Atlantic, you have to pay as much as the whole bar of gold. That's quite expensive, you know? And so that necessarily means that you can't just keep moving gold around, you have to centralize it. And that, in my mind, is the Achilles heel of gold. That's what makes it vulnerable. It's not that governments went door to door and put guns to people's head and forced them to hand over their gold. In the majority of the world, that's not the case. At least, definitely wasn't the case in the most important advanced economies of the world in the early 20th century. They didn't do this in the US, in France, in Europe, in Germany. That's not how it happened. But the gold was already there in a central bank. It had to be in a central bank because you had to have the system of batching the transactions effectively and doing periodic clearance rather than moving the gold around with each transaction. The advantage that Bitcoin has, well, two advantages. The first one is that it is even harder than gold. So gold is always increasing at 1.5 to 2%, which means that the supply of gold, the global stockpile of gold doubles roughly every 50 years or so. 40 years, 50 years, the supply of gold will double. Whereas in Bitcoin supply is never going to double. Bitcoin supply is stuck at 21 million, and that's it. We're already almost at 19 million. So we only have another 2 million to produce over the next century or so. So Bitcoin supply is completely inelastic, completely irresponsive to demand. And then in the Fiat Standard, I compare also the salability of Bitcoin across space. Well, with Bitcoin, you can move the equivalent of a gold bar, which is around $700,000 right now. You can move $700,000 across the Atlantic with Bitcoin, currently for a few cents. I know this is going to go up, but it still has an enormous margin to go up before it hits anywhere near the cost of moving gold around. So I think there will be, solutions for scaling Bitcoin that are going to improve it, but improve the cost of moving Bitcoin around. But still, it's so much cheaper than gold, and it's so much harder to confiscate than gold, that I think it has a much better chance of defeating government centralization than gold.
Okay, so now that I think we've laid the groundwork for people understanding what the Fiat Standard is, what I liked about your book is you can sort of break the human experience, I'm not sure what the right word is for it, down into really two big chunks. You've got financial and cultural. And in the book, you detail the ways in which both of those are tremendously impacted. I have a quote sort of that covers each section from your book, and I want to read the first one now, which was it literally stopped me in my tracks. And this, I'm going to read, it's a long quote, but I want to read the whole thing so that people understand the financial side of this, the implication of having a system that inflates over time and uses boom and bust cycle versus something that deflates over time. And when you hear that, I'm just going to read the quote, because the first time you hear the numbers, the one that is bad sounds good, and the one that is good sounds bad. And I think, a huge part of how people end up getting lost in all of this. All right, this is a quote from the book. The average U.S. house price in 1915 was $3,500. In 2021, it was $269,039. That is a compound annual growth rate in the price of the house at a rate of 4.18% over 107 years. Had the Fiat Standard adopted a fixed supply in 1914, so not inflating, and prices declined by 2% per year instead, the average American house today would cost $411. And I can hear people panicking because that sounds terrible. With a much smaller supply of the dollar, prices would be far lower than they are today. Incomes would, of course, also be much lower, but the decreasing price of goods means that they become more affordable over time, and that saved money buys more goods every year. $411 in 1915 could have bought your great-grandfather 12% of a house, but if he had saved it and passed it on to you, it would buy you an entire house today. Your grandfather's pocket change would be enough for you to live off of today. A world of decreasing prices would provide people with a strong reason to save for the future, and one can only imagine how much better living standards would be today had humanity not been afflicted by inflationary fiat. All right, help people understand why on earth they would want their house to be worth $411 today. That just seems so impossible and so counterintuitive and so zero sum. Like if Bitcoin can't be inflated, then if I get some Bitcoin, it means y'all motherfuckers, you get no Bitcoin, or at least not those. So it seems to somebody who grew up in a fiat system, it seems bad. Why isn't it bad?
Well, I mean, if you think it's bad, then why don't you just go move to Venezuela or Lebanon, where your house is going to be worth 10 billion of the local currency? So, you know, if you're trying to collect zeros next to your house valuation, move to Zimbabwe, Lebanon, Venezuela, go where the hyperinflation is, and you'll have the most valuable house. Obviously, people don't care about how many zeros you attach to their to prices of goods. You know, people care about the purchasing power of money, and this is really one of those very, very, very obvious insights. But you have to basically be part of or subscribe to the ideas of the Austrian School of Economics to be willing to just accept this very obvious thing that any human being with half a brain will accept. You have to, you know, like, what do you prefer? Would you rather have $10 or 100 yens? Well, 100 yens are worth a lot less than $10. So people prefer to have the $10. It doesn't matter the exact number. What matters is the purchasing power. What can you buy with it? And so the choice is not between having a, you know, in a world in which your house would have been worth $400, your day-to-day transaction would be done in cents, more or less. So, you know, we'd have 1 cent bill, and it would be probably worth something like the $100 bill today. And then we'd have units that are smaller, and then the cent would be divided into smaller and smaller units. And that's fine. So then, yeah, you could have your house be worth 400 million of the smaller unit of a cent or whatever it is. But the point is that in that world where the money appreciates, every year, you know, 4 generations of your family, going back to 107 years ago, every one of your family for the last 4 generations, every year they had the choice of saving money that every year was going to be worth slightly more the next year. So think about your family over the last 4 generations, and I think pretty much everybody, no matter where you are in the world, everybody has gone through, you know, everybody's family has gone through a period in which they witnessed their savings essentially get wiped out. Either it would happen suddenly, you know, bank failure or bank collapse or a financial crisis, or it happened gradually through inflation. But everybody has seen this, and everybody has learned their lesson not to save. Everybody has accepted the idea that you shouldn't be saving. And so everybody has been living in debt, and everybody's been financially insecure. And then because of debt...
That doesn't seem true. Now, I obviously have read your book, so I know what the punchline is, but I think it's worth explaining to people because I was taught to save. My mom taught me to save. And yet, as you, and I think a lot of people will feel that way, but as you actually look at what society does versus what your mother may have told you to do, the evidence starts to mount that people really, really discount the future. But give us a couple examples of how we can see that the statement that we've all been taught not to save is true.
Well, I think a lot of parents teach their kids to save, but it's pretty bad advice. Like if you save in the Fiat Standard, I mean, if you save money, if you hold on to money, you're witnessing it basically lose its value by 5, 10, 15% per year. And, you know, the kind of actionable information from understanding the fiat. So, you know, when you read the Bitcoin Standard, you come up with the conclusion, the inescapable conclusion that you need to buy Bitcoin. You need to be long Bitcoin because there's only so many and the world is going to find out and the price is going to go up. Well, when you read fiat, you come up with the conclusion that you need to be short fiat. In fact, you realize that that's basically how people get rich on a fiat standard. In fact, you know, listen to people like, say, Kiyosaki, who wrote Rich Man, Poor Man. You look at a lot of the successful businessmen, the way to get rich is to accumulate hard assets and accumulate cash yielding assets while accumulating also debt. You want to have your liabilities be things that are scarce, and you want to have your assets be things that are scarce: houses, companies, real estate, stocks, bonds, etc. And then you want to have your liabilities be fiat. You want to owe dollars. So in fact, it turns out, you know, saving is good for building character for young people, but really once you get into the real world, you know, you don't just save up to buy your house, and people who do that end up really paying a lot more than if you just take a loan. When you take a loan to pay the house, you're shorting the dollar, and then you benefit from the inflation because the value of your loan repayment goes down. And especially true in the case of hyperinflation. You know, I have friends in Lebanon who had loans to buy houses, and then with the collapse of the lira, collapse of the local currency, now their loans are 95% discounted. They have to pay them back in a currency that is, so they keep the house and they just have to pay very, very little amount of money. So the people who didn't take out loans and saved money in the bank got wiped out. And that's happened all over the world. It happens very quickly during the case of hyperinflation, but it's happening slowly today around you. Like imagine if you have your money in the bank, if you've been saving, what is your bank giving you in terms of interest? 0.2%, 1%, 2%, best case scenario? Well, you're losing every year 5 or 10% or so because look at the price of the house that you want to buy. You know, especially if you want to buy a nice house in a nice neighborhood. Look at the price. You know, can you save up? Here's the question. Can you actually save up to buy a house in Miami Beach? Think about how much income you need in order to save up to buy a house in Miami Beach versus how much income you'd need to buy it in debt. And if you buy it with debt, you get the short contract on the US dollar, and then your repayments are going down over time, and so the house is just continuously getting cheaper and cheaper. You know, you live in it today and then it gets cheaper. If you try to save up for it, I mean, you'd need to have astronomically high income to be able to save in a saving account that appreciates at 1%, while the Miami Beach house that you want is appreciating at 5, 10, 15% per year.
So help me understand something, because as you're saying this, I'm starting to think, okay, what do I need to take loans out on? Like, how do I, get myself in a better situation? The catch is, though, that if I'm still getting paid in the fiat, it's the two are tied. So it's going down, like my purchasing power is going down at the same rate that my loan is technically getting cheaper. So it ends up feeling like a wash. So I guess I'm going back to then your earlier point. I have to have a hard asset that's going up in value. So I've got that. I can't just have my my short on the dollar. I have to have something over here that's going up. So as this goes down, I'm laughing because it's getting easier and easier for me to pay it. But the key is to have both. You can't just have one. Or you can't just have the debt, I guess.
This was like the kind of breakthrough insight that made me tie the book together when Michael Saylor came into the Bitcoin world and started talking about how he's really, what his strategy is and his idea of why he's borrowing in order to hold Bitcoin. And when he explained, this is what rich people do. If you're rich, you have hard assets, you have an old building, you have real estate, you have a factory. You don't need to work in a fiat system. You just are constantly refinancing, and your loans continue to get cheaper and you continue to take out money. And the goal, is to die with a lot of debt. Like, this is how you win in the fiat game. You win by accumulating the most debt. But you have to always, and this is the tricky part. Like, this is, all right, so this is the kind of great side of it, is that, you just keep clocking up more debt and running up a bigger tab on the bar, and then you die. and you win, basically. But of course, the risky part, and that's why I think, you know, it's not a universally good thing. The risky part is that at any month you miss a payment, you risk losing all of your assets. So, well, not any month, you know, it's going to be a few months, but if your business has a few bad months, you might miss the payments. You could lose the business. And that's why basically I think, you know, everybody's just massively insecure, and everybody is heavily discounting the future because the future is so much more uncertain in this world, as opposed to a world in which we just accumulate savings that appreciate. Because in that world where you're trying to accumulate a positive score, it's, you know, you're running up a score in terms of let's get as much gold coins as we can. The more gold coins that you have, the better you sleep at night, the more secure you are, the less you have to worry about whether your business is going to make it this month or not, or whether you're going to end up being homeless, or whether you're going to lose your business. But in a world in which you have, debt, and you're just running up more and more and more debt, the more debt you're running up, the more insecure you are.
This episode is brought to you by Peak, where plants and science intersect. Go to peaktea.com/impact. You'll get 5% off your first order. And use code IMPACT at checkout to get free shipping. Enjoy the episode.
Yeah. This game is a very complicated game. I never thought that I would need to pay attention to this, and now I'm realizing how important it is to really understand how money works and finances, which is why I've been doing more and more shows around it. Okay, so I think we're starting to understand the financial implications of fiat and how people have to really understand how the system works in terms of inflation being problematic, your purchasing power is going down, the sort of ultimate dichotomy of what you're talking about, but it's a risky game in the end. Now I want to start getting into the cultural implications. You make a really strong case in the book that, in fact, earlier you alluded to it and you were like, yeah, that's the 20th century for you. I want to read another quote from the book around the cultural implications. It just happened to be one specific example that you were giving, and then we can sort of extrapolate beyond that. But it really, reading your book really impressed upon me how much of what I, again, think of culturally as just being the reality of the way that the human world works and that there is no alternative, and seeing that, hey, a lot of things can be traced back to having an easy money system, basically. So here's the quote. Again, it's lengthy, but I think worth reading. Perhaps the most pernicious effect of the fiatization of the modern university is the destruction of the scientific method. What passes for science now is a mix of government propaganda, corporate advertising, make-work welfare programs for nerds, and research papers that amount to meaning-free, irrelevant gibberish. This sad state of affairs persists and survives because government intervention has removed the market test for success. With funding for research primarily coming from government bureaucrats, academics don't need to worry about real-world profitable applications of their work. Irrelevant research bears no cost for the researcher or his institution. And with universities afforded an effective subsidy through subsidized loans for their consumers, the market test for success is removed, and universities and the geeks populating their offices are free to drift into a world of insignificance and corruption, a world with little regard for truth. The most obvious manifestation of this is the mushrooming of entire fields and departments specialized in producing completely inconsequential and incoherent noises and marketing them as scholarship. What passes for humanities in the modern university has degenerated into an endless sea of angry grievances and rabid victimology, consisting almost entirely of politically corrupt platitudes and zero substance. The end result is heaps of graduates with zero marketable skills, but a strong talent for finding ways to take offense at everything. These departments continue to grow, and the professors in them continue to get paid because they face no real market test and can continue to secure financing from the world's biggest money printer while railing against inconsequential, imaginary, and historical evils. How is that? Let's assume that we can get people to agree, some people. How is that the result of fiat money?
Well, it's obviously the result of fiat money in my mind because universities today don't operate in the market, and that's really the key point. In a free market,
students can decide which college they want to go to. How's that not the free market?
Well, because their choice of the choice is not which college they go to. The choice really is whether they should go to college or not, and that's a choice that's heavily skewed by two ways in which the money printer intervenes. The first is that the money printer heavily subsidizes student loans, which sounds like one of these applehood and motherhood and apple pie. Motherhood and apple pie kind of ideas, which are just always, how could you be against it? Universities are great. And the reality is, no, you can actually be against university. I taught at university, and I've been to universities, and I spent a lot of time. And I'll tell you, I've spoken to many students where I asked them when they're finishing their university, you've just spent all this amount of money, of your father's money, on university, and you still have no idea what you want to do. You could have just gone and worked in this field where you're interested for 4 years, earning whatever you could have made, and saved your father's money, and now you'd have all of that money to start a business. Wouldn't you be better off? And many of them have said, yeah, I would. And the same thing applies, obviously, if you take on loans. You end up with 4 years of no marketable skills or little marketable skills, and then a big loan. So the reason this seems like a good idea is because the concept of opportunity cost is destroyed by fiat. And this is a theme that I keep returning to throughout the book. The idea of opportunity cost is central to all economics. Everything has an opportunity cost. Everything is a great idea if you don't think of the opportunity cost. Going to university for all of your life, collecting university degrees until you're 90 years old is a great idea. Yeah, let's do a PhD in physics and in mathematics and in linguistics and in chemistry and do them all. Who could hate knowledge? Well, but there is an opportunity cost. Every time you're doing a PhD, you're not doing other things. You're not starting a business. You're not earning money. You're not having a job. So fiat allows us to basically suspend our conception of what opportunity cost is, instead of,
because it's removing the market. Like, how is it doing that? What is the mechanism by which it creates that incentive structure?
We can't save our own money. So your money, if you just put it in the bank, it's losing value. So you don't want to save money. And B, the government can just basically bring money into existence if you just give them a good idea that appeals to them. So if you do something that sounds good for the government, you can get infinite amounts of money for it, and there's really no cost to it. So they're able to make more money out of thin air, and that's really what distorts all of those things. In a free market with hard money, the universities can't just continue to teach irrelevant nonsense. All of these econ departments teaching fantasy economics, Keynesian economics, they can't continue to teach all of this nonsense because you're clearly producing people with a very delusional perspective on the world, and then when they get out into the world, they can't succeed with these ideas. But if you're being paid to do it by somebody who has a money printer, who can just make as much money as is possible, as is needed in order to continue to keep this happening, nobody's really paying the cost, or the people who are paying the cost are society at large. And so
I'm not tracking this. So how is the government paying the schools? Does this only count for governmental schools? Does this also cover private schools? Is it because the loans are easy to get? Like, in what way is the government paying for
two main
schools?
ways. The first one is loans to students. So this is enormously subsidized, very low interest rates, and that's just massively tempting for people to get in because you can take out essentially a couple of $100,000 when you're 18 years old. I mean,
and that's the government mining for fiat to get people in debt.
That's the government mining fiat because education is motherhood and apple pie. And the other aspect of it is that the majority of university income comes from research grants, government research grants. So the role of the government in financing universities is enormous. Tuition fees are only a small chunk of university income. And universities that rely on tuition fees are just, they can't compete with the big universities that get government money for research. So and I discussed this in detail in the chapter on fiat science. I think, if you wonder why is it that, every day there's a new headline about coffee causing cancer, but also protecting from cancer, and wine causes cancer while also protecting from cancer, and tomatoes can cause this while actually protecting from. There's an infinite supply of money to be churning out these studies, because, people think that this science is a good thing. So if you're in an academic position, there's no cost to publishing something that is wrong, but there's a very high cost for not publishing. And so, because
why is there a high cost for not publishing?
Because you lose your job. You have to publish in order to keep your job. So everybody's it's a big giant rat race where everybody's, they're running on this mill where they're producing all these papers that nobody reads, and nobody cares if they're right or wrong. There's no sense of, let's actually figure out, is coffee good for you or is it not? Does it cause or protect from cancer? Does it make you live forever, or does it kill you on the spot? Nobody cares. You can publish papers with all of these conclusions as long as you are as long as you're just basically adhering by the kind of superficial standards of these papers. So there's no sane kind of sense of what's the real opportunity cost, because there's no market test. There's no test of, all right, well, this guy said this in this paper, let's take this out into the real world and see if it actually works in that way. You don't have to have the market test. The market test is not applied to this. And that's why you can get all these insane ideas come out of universities today. And, I begin by knocking on humanities, because that's easy and everybody does it. But I think, humanities aren't much better than the natural sciences, because really, people are freaking out about the idea that cow farts are going to boil oceans, and that's university research. And they're freaking out about all kinds of things. It's a constant stream of hysteria, because if you have concerning hysterical findings that suggest, oh no, the earth is going to be destroyed, then you are more likely to get funding. There's no opportunity cost to the people providing financing. They don't have to think about whether we are better off directing our resources toward this researcher or that researcher in the sense of which one is going to give us a more accurate answer. They are thinking about it from the perspective of if this is concerning, we need to give all the resources that we can. And that's why research budgets just continue to mushroom, and the amount of research that is produced continues to mushroom, and the research is always headed in the way of more hysteria and more concern and more calamities. It's chicken littleism, basically, as an idea, because that's the motivation. If you go into research and say, well, I've looked into cow farts and I've concluded cow farts are not going to destroy planet Earth, well, guess what? You don't need more funding to study cow farts anymore. That's it. That's done. But if I look into cow farts and I think, oh no, cow farts are going to destroy the planet, well, now I need a much bigger research budget to look into them, and I need a research center, and I need to hire a whole bunch of people to look into it with me. And so we see how this is reflected in many fields where we go all through these hysterias, where everybody is always fascinated by this. And of course, that also helps with, that also will inevitably be driven by the agendas of the people funding it. It's ultimately political. It's ultimately government money. It's bureaucracies that are that have political goals and objectives, and so they push funding toward the kind of hysteria that they want to hear about.
Ooh, okay, so I'm going to see if I can reiterate all of this. There are some pretty aggressive claims. So, all right, you've got the government is printing money. They can print as much as they want. They mine fiat by getting people in debt. One of, because we're talking about universities, but it really is just one of the examples you use in the book. So we're just going through this example as one way fiat distorts incentives, which then have these huge knock-on effects. So they mine for fiat by getting people in debt. One of the sort of easy targets, because it's motherhood and apple pie, is education. So let's make education nice and cheap. So we subsidize the loans. So the loans have a very low cost. students take out then these massive loans to go to school, but which could be a good thing were it turning out people that are extraordinarily gifted at things that the world cares about deeply and that really matter and move the needle in a meaningful way for humanity. But we don't end up with that result because there is an incentive that I don't know if it was originally tied to fiat or not, but a decision was made that publishing is good. Okay, so to keep your job, you must publish.
I'll say the issue here is that, you know, think about the example of Soviet cars. Why did Soviet cars suck? Because they were produced in the same way that modern research in modern American universities is produced. It's from the top down. Imagine, you know, it's the same thing. You have a committee of people that decide which car factory is going to get funding, and then they allocate the cars to the consumers. Whereas in non-Soviet countries, you know, compare East German cars to West German cars. In West Germany, Mercedes or BMW, they had to make their own cars and they had to come up with their own decisions, and they had to then get the consumer to willingly take money out of their own pocket to pay for the car. So that forces them to make cars that are good, that don't suck, that convince the consumer to come up with something that, to come up with valuable money and pay for it. But in the Soviet Union, when the money comes from above, you know, you don't even have to posit, and this is kind of the key insight from Austrian economics when it comes to socialism, is that socialism is not an incentive problem. It's not just that you have corrupt people. It's not that you have lazy people. Socialism is a calculation problem. This is the economic problem of socialism, and it's something that most socialists cannot come to terms with. Even if you solve the incentive problem of socialism, it is not a workable system, because it's not possible for the East German car factory to figure out how to make cars properly unless they get feedback from the customer. Unless they put the cars out and the customers willingly pay for them, and the customers have a choice between their car and all the other cars, and they choose this model rather than that model, and then the producer asks themselves, why is it that they like this over that one? Well, let's focus on the things that they like. Let's get rid of the things that they don't like. Let's focus on the things that we can make profitably. If you can make something profitably, that's telling you that you're using your capital productively. So when you sever that process so that the money doesn't come from the consumer, the money comes from above, from basically the money printer, you end up with shitty East German cars, and you end up with shitty academic journals that produce all of this pseudoscience and babble, basically.
Wow, that was a really good way of explaining that. Okay, that certainly hits home. Central planning is an idea that runs through the book. And why do we have the temptation towards central planning? And how is a hard money like Bitcoin, or maybe to you, Bitcoin is the only thing that's going to make this happen, how is that going to solve the problem? Does it shift incentive structures? What does that look like?
Yeah, I think it's all about the figurative printing press. It's all about the ability to make debt into money. So what happened in World War I, and the first couple of chapters of the book are a little bit more history, which looks at the way in which that monetary system was installed in the West during World War I. Later on in the 1930s, a con artist by the name of John Maynard Keynes came along and wrote a bunch of stupid books about why this actually is a better way of running the monetary system. But this is really just like the fake excuse that you come up with after you've already, you know, so like you've totaled your father's car, and then you go to your dad and you tell him, you know, Daddy, actually I think this is better for you. You don't need the headlights. Let me explain to you why cars are better without headlights. But you know, they went off the gold standard in 1914. 15, 16, there was never an admission. It was totally surreptitious. It was manipulative. It was a lie. It was done by central banks behind people's back. And there was never an honest admission that, hey, we're going off the gold standard. It was always, no, we're on the gold standard. We're coming back to the gold standard. We're just suspending redeemability for a bit. Don't worry about it. Everything's going to be fine. We're just fighting a war.
And what example did he give for why it was this car is better without headlights?
Well, basically, it's extremely stupid, I have to say. And I mean this not just, you know, to throw away a gratuitous insult. It's a very well earned insult. It's the idea that if you have a recession, which was the case in the 1930s, because they'd gone off the gold standard for 20 years and had been trying to basically pretend that they were still on the gold standard while they were off the gold standard. That causes recessions. You know, you have complete dislocation in the labor market and in all kinds of products markets, where people are unable to invest and spend money in a way that is that meets market demands. And so you have, you know, just like if you had price controls in anything, you get shortages and surpluses. You had price controls over wages and labor, and so that's what led to unemployment. So the sane answer would have been, get rid of those shortages and stop the inflation, and then, you know, prices will adjust and people will go back to work just like they were working before 1914, when you had the gold standard for 50, 60 years and you didn't have these massive economic problems that occurred after abandoning the gold standard. But effectively what they did is they broke the gold standard and they blamed the gold standard for why it didn't work. So what he said was, this unemployment is caused by an insufficient amount of demand. People are just not spending enough money. And they're not spending enough money because we're on the gold standard. And the way to fix it is for the government to print a whole bunch of money and hand it out to people. And then that, you know, it's like getting an engine going. You know, you crank the engine and then it gets going. So if we just throw in a whole bunch of spending, the engine will get going. And then we'll have more money circulating in the economy. And then that leads to more people being hired. And then when people start getting hired more and more, they'll start spending more and more. And then the economy kicks into gear.
Isn't that true though? Like, I get how it devalues the money, but so you made an argument earlier that I completely buy into, which is when you go to a fiat standard, you discount the future and therefore people spend money. So it may be a horrible reason to do it, but if you do create this thing where people are discounting the future, the money's going down in value, money's there to be spent, you will create, until the bubble bursts, you will create this sense of like, word, I've got money, I'm going to spend it. So didn't it get the engine going, just at a huge cost?
It gets a destructive engine going. It gets an engine going where we save less, we destroy capital, we consume capital. It's basically eating the seed corn. That's the thing. So, you know, if you sold all of your properties today, yeah, you could spend a lot of money this week. Like, you could throw the sickest party of your life if you sold everything you owned. And that's really the logic there. So the sane kind of classical economists, what they were saying is, get back on the gold standard, and then prices will fall where they will adjust to where they need to be, and people will spend money as much as they need to, and markets will clear and the world will work as it did.
Now, did you look at it closely enough to know why the unemployment actually was happening?
Yeah, the reason the unemployment was happening was because of the inflation. So the part that the Keynesians skip is the part of the history which I focus on in chapter 1, which is that the money supply in England more than doubled during the period between 1914 and 1920. So the money supply doubled. And the redemption of gold, the redemption of the British pound into gold was suspended. So that you couldn't buy gold from the central bank. You couldn't just go and give them their paper and take gold, because they had so much gold paper outstanding. So they inflated the money supply, and they wanted people to believe that they didn't inflate the money supply. So they wanted to keep wages and prices as they were. But obviously that's impossible. That's like trying to square a circle, because people are, there's more money out there, so prices are rising. And then because prices are rising, people are unable to buy a lot of the things that they want to buy. And so you end up with shortages, you end up with surpluses, you end up with problems in the labor market. Businesses can't hire workers because they can't sell their goods. So all of this would have been solved if the Bank of England just said, you know what, sorry, we messed up. We were fighting a war with the evil Germans. We had to do this. We did an inflation. We're sorry. Let's revalue the pound. You know, if they just revalued the pound, it said, all right, let's go back to a gold standard, but we have to revalue it at, like, I think it would have been 20-30% less.
Revalued compared to gold?
Exactly. So the price of gold, 1 ounce of gold was about £4 at that time, 4¼ pounds, 4.25. So if they'd just gone back to a gold standard at 1 ounce of gold at £5, then, you know, it would have sucked for people who had savings, but it would have been just a one-time hit, and then you're back to building on a solid foundation. You're back to having a free market economy where prices reflect fundamentals and where wages will adjust in a way that gets everybody working. But as long as they were trying to manipulate this, as long as they were trying to hide that deception, they continued to suffer from the problem of unemployment. And then, and like the really scammy thing about it is that what you're doing by printing money is the same thing as you would do if you just let the wages fall. And Keynesians are the only people stupid enough to think that people would rather earn less money with more numbers or less value with more numbers than you know, the same amount of value with smaller numbers. It's ridiculous. It's the same example that we were mentioning earlier about the house. Like, Keynesians are the only people who would tell you, no, it's better to live in a house that has a lot of zeros next to its valuation. They're the only people who would move to a hyperinflationary economy, because that would mean that they could buy a house that's worth a lot of trillions of dollars. It's nonsense. So, you know, the workers needed to take a pay cut, and that was the result of the inflation. If you didn't want the workers to take a pay cut, you shouldn't have done the inflation. But the governments, because it was a democracy, they had elections, they didn't, no president or prime minister anywhere in the world wanted to be the one to go up and say, hey guys, sorry, the minimum wage has to go down. You have to start earning less. That's just political suicide. So what you do is you print a lot of money, and then the real wage drops, even though the nominal wage stays the same. And so, you know, your salary was $100, let's say, and it used to be that, well, if you just take $80, everything would go back to normal and the economy would revive and we'd be back on a gold standard. Well, let's just print 20% more money, and now your $100 are worth $80. And now we didn't give you a pay cut.
But you still get the $100.
Exactly.
You just don't get the $100 of value.
Exactly. That's really all. That's the Keynesian scam in a nutshell. And like, Keynes admits it, and it's the book, I think, is an absolutely pathetic intellectual exercise of just equivocating and trying to justify this and trying to find ways of making this explainable and acceptable by somebody who just clearly had no understanding of economics in any meaningful sense.
Really interesting. So I buy the argument. What I will say is that, as you have pointed out, it will be more palatable. And so when you're, I know virtually nothing about Austrian economics, but the little thing that I do know, which is that it's an acknowledgement that humans derive value subjectively in their minds. Now, it might be based on something, but ultimately you need that subjective layer. It seems to me, again, I know even less about Keynesian economics than I know about Austrian economics, but it does seem to, even though it's gross and I don't like it, that they're taking advantage of this, that Keynesian economists are saying, look, it's just reality. Like, people aren't going to respond to that. And people would, whether they should or not, they would rather have a house that's valued at, you know, $269,000 than $411. It just is. And if you ignore that fact, you're going to ignore it at your own peril. And while I actually think they are wrong, and I, in my limited ability to understand economics, find myself gravitating towards your argument, I can't help, even as I invest into Bitcoin, I cannot help but have unease about what happens societally, at least through the transition. You know, maybe, just like you said, hey, just suck it up. You were getting $100, you're gonna get $80 of value no matter what. So let's just call it $80. I worry that in that moment, I don't know if that's a year, I don't know if it's 10 years, but as we transition to a hard money standard, because you've said over time, societies that can always do move towards hard money, and it certainly seems like we're moving towards hard money now, but that there will be a reaction. And there will be a reaction from some people, there will be a reaction from governments, and while it's gross, at least as you present the Keynesian side, that is gross. I'm with you, I don't like it, doesn't feel right, but they are hinting at a truth of human nature that is we are going to have to deal with, reconcile something when people start getting real upset that their money isn't worth what they thought it was.
I think that's incorrect, because the reality is they try and present it. The Keynesians always try and present it as if they're out there looking for the little guy, but the reality is they're just looking out for the big banks and the government. They're looking out for the people in power
to keep everybody quiet. Like, hey, let's just keep everybody quiet.
Not even that, because the people who would really get hurt from this, the people who would really get hurt from the kind of what we're arguing against is, here's the thing, like, again, it's the fiat idea of opportunity cost not existing that even makes the debate frameable in these terms. If you're going to inflate, if you're going to have the ability of the government to just get off the gold standard and continue to inflate, it's not like you're just going to solve this problem once and for all and then it's over. Then this inflation is going to lay the groundwork for the next bubble, with the next credit expansion, when then we get the next crash, and then that will require the next set of adjustment, which is going to require more credit expansion. So the choice is not, we just take the pain once and then we solve this problem and we prevent social unrest. It's we get into this problem, we get into this world where government and the banking system have the ability to constantly make more and more money to their benefit, while presenting it as if it is to the benefit of the working class, while constantly screwing over the working class, who are constantly getting laid off and going through these business cycles. That's one side of it. On the other hand, we have an actual example of what happened when this kind of unpopular, supposedly catastrophic and apocalyptic path was taken. And that was what happened in the US. The US did not do what the British did in 1920 after the war. The US actually did go through a recession in 1920. The US went back on the gold standard in 1921 or 22, I'm not sure exactly, I mentioned it in the book. And then it suffered a short and sharp recession. And fortunately for the US, apparently at that time, President Calvin Coolidge was a guy who knew how to have fun and had more pressing things to do than go and destroy the economy with Keynesian insanity. So he was throwing parties and enjoying himself in the White House, while the recession, basically, it was a painful recession that went on for a few months. But then after that recession was over, the economy recovered, and then you had a massive boom in the 1920s. So Britain, on the other hand, continued to suffer through this pain of constantly seeking to lie about the fact that they went off the gold standard and couldn't go back on the gold standard throughout the 1920s. And so its problems continued to get exacerbated throughout the 1920s. And then what they did effectively was export their inflation problem to the US. Because, and I discussed this in detail in the book, the British Central Bank, the Bank of England, basically convinced the French and the American central banks to inflate their own money supply in order to prevent the flight of gold from England to the US. Because in the US, in England, okay, you couldn't redeem your pounds for gold, but you could redeem your pounds for dollars, which you could then redeem for gold in the US and then ship your dollars to England. So people continued to do that, and they would sell there, and that would cause the gold to leave England. And so the English somehow convinced the poor American really simpleton central bankers that the way to fix the problems of England was to have inflation in the US. And that's what led to the big inflation of the 1920s, which led to the Great Depression, which led to the stock market crash of 1929 and then the Great Depression. So we have the test of that. We've had these examples many times across history where you have the quick, sharp, painful recession for a few months, and then life goes back to normal and everybody recovers. And on the other hand, you have the system where we're constantly inflating more and more, which is what happened in the 1930s, both in Britain and in the US. And that serves people in power, people in governments, and of course it serves banks. Because the biggest creditors are banks. The biggest borrowers are banks. They're the ones who benefit the most from the devaluation of the currency, because they're the ones who owe the biggest amounts of money.
Wow. Okay, so the plot thickens. As you were explaining all that, I thought, okay, then if people have been playing all these games with money this whole time, and smart people already sort of understand the game, and Bitcoin is a better gold, then that all sort of fingers point to gold as being it should give us examples of what Bitcoin is going to look like in terms of how it settles into the basket of offerings, if you will. So if we know that we're deflating the currency over time, its value, and that we want hard assets, why isn't gold? Because like there's a picture being presented of like, yo, Bitcoin is going to be worth $1 gazillion. Like, this is crazy. Just hold it. But that didn't happen to gold. It hit some sort of threshold and then it just sort of wavers. So is that because gold is still deflationary at 2% a year, and that gives it that sort of ceiling? Or is it that Bitcoin is only ever going to match gold, and so we're just replacing that? And it's, I mean, look, it's interesting. It's very valuable to be trillions of dollars, but it's not going to be that thing that just like keeps eating more and more asset classes. Because if people didn't react to gold like must have it, why would they react like that to Bitcoin?
Because again, it goes back to the point about gold's spatial salability. Gold just can't play the role of money as long as governments don't let it play that role. It needs central banks. It needs complicated settlement infrastructure. And all of that, in order for that to happen, you need the permission of governments. You need physical infrastructure to allow governments, physical infrastructure to be allowed by governments to operate. And so that's why today, in the Fiat Standard, I look at where, if you want to think about what is Bitcoin's potential, gold is just the first rung of the ladder, really, because gold is not what people use as cash today. Like, how much of your portfolio or the average person's portfolio is in gold today? Very little. Some people hold significant amounts of gold, but the vast majority don't. And you still hold cash, but your cash really, in a sense, there are two things that you can hold in your portfolio. You can hold cash or you can hold investment. Investments are equity that yield a return, and they have a risk. So that's the risk part of your portfolio. Cash is something where you are trying to be conservatives. You don't want to take a risk with it. You want to just hold on to it. The point of it is that it holds on to value. So what do people use today that is not meant to offer risk, that is meant to hold on to value? Physical cash is one thing. A saving account is another. Gold is one small thing. But the major one, the major part of people's portfolio that plays the role of cash is bonds. Bonds, because they don't have equity risk. So you have senior creditor. If the company that is issuing a bond goes bankrupt, the bondholders get paid before the stockholders. So that's why people want to hold bonds. And of course, government bonds. You get the government being able to print money, which makes things easier for you. So, in a sense, gold can't fulfill these functions because governments want their bonds to replace the function of gold. That's really the kind of scam. They want you to hold their bonds because that just gives them money, allows them to print money, allows them to finance themselves, allows them to finance all the stupid bullshit that they like. And so we have, the total gold market in the world is something in the range of around $10 trillion. But the total bond market is somewhere in the range of $100 to $140 trillion or something like that. So, exactly. So it's
maybe I just have not been paying close enough attention. But the bond as the governmental dirty trick of creating a gold-like safe thing. Whoa. Okay, that's one that's exciting from there's a bigger asset class that people are already using for this thing. Because when I listen to Michael Saylor a lot, and again, maybe I just never heard him say it or wasn't paying attention somehow, but haven't thought about that. People often talk about, is it going to start eating into real estate because real estate is used as a hard asset? And I was always like, but real estate you can live in. So there's like a thing. I just can't see real estate ceasing to be a thing. But bonds, I can see bonds ceasing to be a thing.
Yes, that's kind of one of my conclusions of my analysis in the book. That in one of the final chapters, I basically argue Bitcoin's going to end this entire barbaric, idiotic practice of bonds. I think Bitcoin's going to eat the bond market. I see no reason for bonds to exist in a Bitcoin world. I think bonds exist because borrowing is the equivalent of mining, and bonds are debt, and that's why bond issuance is so profitable. But this has just been abused to a point right now where, I mean, governments, highly irresponsible governments have bonds that are trading in the billions. It's insane that people give them this money, and it shouldn't be the case. If you look at, say, for instance, the U.S. government is a AAA rating, but if you looked at its balance sheet and if you treated it as a corporation and you looked at its balance sheet, and I'll discuss the details of this, like what a bondholder, if you told them, all right, look at the numbers, let's say you knocked out 3 zeros from the numbers and you turned it from trillions to billions, and you told them, here's a corporation, let me see what you think of their rating. They would not be a AAA rated bond. They would be junk bond. They'd be, B minus or double B or something like that, depending on which rating. But they'd be junk, firmly in the junk category. And that's the U.S. government. And then, you look at the rest of the other governments, they'd all be sub-junk. They would not even get on the bond market if it was like that. And I think...
simply because they spend so much more than they make.
Exactly. And the only reason that they can get into bonds is because everybody is counting on their ability to inflate their money supply and devalue their people. So the bond market is just, wow, it's evil through and through.
Wow. When you say it like that, it is, it doesn't sound good. Man, this is crazy. This is crazy. I have stepped through a door that I did not see coming. So as I walk through this door and I have more and more realizations like this, that the bond market is, I'll say, potentially evil. It's so new to me as a concept, but I don't have any arguments against it as you explain it.
But I mean, look at it today. Even the best bonds are not keeping up with inflation. Like, even if you're taking on risk with bonds and you're getting high interest rate, you're not keeping up with inflation. So the entire practice is just falling apart. And holding on to Bitcoin is so infinitely better, and it's so much more secure, and it doesn't have default risk. It's that's the real jackpot. Gold is just going to be the small little appetizer that we have before devouring the bond market, I think.
Whoa. I'll be turning that into a clip. Jesus, man. Okay, so now my next question, and this is the one that I think about maybe more than I want to. Does this happen peacefully? Because it doesn't seem like the government is going to let go of their ability to create bonds and other things, just the ability to print, like saying out loud that the government or anybody is using debt as a mining mechanism to bring value to themselves. Like, whoa, don't you think at some point that there is going to be, I mean, China's obviously already said, fuck this, like no crypto for you, or at least no non-governmental crypto. Does Bitcoin take over peacefully?
I don't have a crystal ball. I don't know. The kind of conclusion of the book is, and the really powerful thing about, remember when we've started this discussion, I told you, approaching fiat from the lens of how I analyzed Bitcoin would be the best way to try and appreciate this question of how is it that Bitcoin arises. And I think I came up with a very, very important conclusion from this, which I think is pretty original. I don't think anybody else has mentioned this before, which is that what we are doing with fiat is that we're monetizing debt. And what Bitcoin is doing is it is monetizing a hard asset, just like gold, but with wings. It can fly very easily. So this means that as Bitcoin continues to get monetized, our demand for holding on to debt and our demand for needing to get into debt are both reduced. So people think, all right, well, Bitcoin rises, that means that everybody dumps the dollar and the dollar goes to zero. But that's only one side of the story. The other side of the story is that as Bitcoin rises, people don't get into debt and therefore don't issue debt, and therefore the issuance of the dollar declines as well. So not only does the dollar's demand decline, but also the dollar's supply declines. And so I think there's a case to be made that this is an upgrade. This is a technological upgrade. This is the free market coming up with a genius solution to the problem that is this fiat cancer that the world has, because we're going to witness the Bitcoin economy appreciate more and more, and we're going to witness the fiat economy basically drift into more and more irrelevance. The supply of fiat is going to contract because people are going to be issuing less debt, fewer bonds. People are not going to want to hold on to bonds. So you think, if you extrapolate Michael Saylor, and you extrapolate El Salvador, and you extrapolate all the Bitcoin holders, they're taking out bonds from their portfolio and they're buying Bitcoin. So they're reducing the demand for the issuance of bonds. They're reducing the demand for the issuance of more debt. And they're causing, so there's no reason that should lead to a massive collapse in fiat. It is just going to lead to the Bitcoin economy growing and appreciating while the fiat economy stagnates, and the value of fiat continues to do what it is always supposed to do, which is shrink in real terms. And in fact, the reason why I think, if I were to make it the optimistic case, and I have known to be delusionally optimistic before. I'm a Liverpool fan who spent 30 years thinking Liverpool are going to win the league every year. But then they did win it after 30 years, so it's not entirely
You were
delusional.
right.
Yeah, I was right. Yeah. So to make the kind of delusionally optimistic case here is that the people who have power in the world are all in debt. The people who have money, the people who have wealth are all in debt. And perhaps, maybe Bitcoin is taking away their ability to print money, but Bitcoin also devalues their debt, and that's a great thing. So if this, if we just, the next 20 years are just a continuation of what we saw in the last 10 years, all of the world's most powerful people are going to witness their debt liabilities wither away into a tiny fraction of what they are in real terms. And the best way for them to do that, that's a great thing. So they will owe less and less, and they can accumulate they can accumulate Bitcoin. And as they accumulate Bitcoin, they benefit from the Bitcoin appreciating, and they benefit from their debt devaluing. That's the Michael Saylor strategy. So as more and more people do this, we reduce the supply of dollars, we reduce the demand for dollars, and we reduce the value of dollars. And that works out fine for the people who have power, and the people who have influence, and the people who have money, and the governments even. Like, you're basically giving everybody a debt jubilee. That's kind of the argument that I put in the last chapter. Bitcoin can be the global debt jubilee because it's just going to make debt worth less and less and less, and it's going to allow us all to upgrade one at a time, as we grasp what is going on. One by one, we upgrade into a superior technology. I think we'll have hyperinflations. We'll always be having hyperinflations, but when we do have those, they're not going to be caused by Bitcoin. They're going to be caused by insane governments like the Lebanese and Venezuelan governments doing what insane governments have always done. But I think the long-term perspective here is that in the long run, I think Bitcoin just continues to grow and fiat continues to wither away. But I have to say, that was the kind of idea with which I started writing the book. But then the whole COVID insanity happened. And now I think with all of this noise being made about the central bank digital currencies, that makes me less delusionally optimistic about that scenario, because I think central bank digital currencies take away that property of fiat as being debt and turns it into just basically the equivalent of the money printing. Remember, I was saying earlier that when you get hyperinflation, it's always when the government just stops. It's always when the government shifts to cranking out new physical pieces of money. Well, central bank digital currencies are the equivalent of running the printer, but digital printer. And there's no restraint in terms of the credit creation that goes on. And it's just straight up inflation. With credit creation, with credit money, with fiat money, the credit creation leads to a boom, and then there's a bust, and the money supply contracts. And so that is a restraint on the growth in the money supply. But if you're just printing out money and handing it to people and buying their votes, essentially, which seems to be the case of what's going to happen, I think things are likely to get uglier and fast.
Why would that make things uglier?
Because there's no business cycle, there's no restraint, there's no.
So we won't get the bust. It will just be inflation, 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 inflation.
Exactly.
So since most of the money that's injected back into the system is done digitally anyway, I think earlier you said 10% physical, 90% digital. Why is removing the 10% of the physical so potent potentially? That I don't understand that.
It's not about the physical. It's about the fact. It's not that you're removing the physical part. It's the converting the physical to digital is inconsequential. It's the fact that it's inconsequential in itself, but the important part is that it allows you to replace the credit dollar with straight up central bank digital currency.
And so that currency now exists. It's basically physical, but I see. So before, because the money wasn't real anyway, when the value disappeared because you couldn't pay your house, poof, that money is now out of the system. And so there was a constant sort of rebalancing. But now we're making a physical, it's digital, but it now exists. I can track it. It's a thing on a blockchain, presumably, that now will go on forever. So there's no check to make it evaporate.
Exactly.
Whoa. Okay. Interesting. Safe. Yeah, this is very intriguing and terrifying and exciting. I don't want to lie. I'm more excited than I am scared, if I'm completely honest. And like you, I may be delusionally optimistic, but that's interesting. I have no ability to prognosticate about what is going to happen in that scenario. It is something very interesting to think about. Man, your book blew me away. Absolutely incredible. Your interviews are always amazing. Where can people find out more about you, follow along on this crazy journey?
My website, Saifedean.com. You can buy my books from there, and you can sign up for my website where I offer courses in economics and the economics of Bitcoin and economics in the Austrian school tradition. So you can join the membership on my website, Saifedean.com. You can buy the books from there, and I'm also pretty active on Twitter, @Saifedean. And there's also my podcast, the Bitcoin Standard podcast.
Amazing. Awesome. Dude, thank you so much for joining me. This was incredible. I hope this is the first of many. And speaking of first of many, if you haven't already, be sure to subscribe. And until next time, my friends, be legendary. Take care. Peace.